So this morning, if you'll turn your Bibles over to Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21, we're mainly just going to stay in that chapter this morning. Luke chapter 21. And if you are visiting with us this morning, we have been in the book of Luke. We have been studying the book of Luke, but we have been taking a different direction in how we study the book of Luke. We're not looking at it verse by verse and passage and doing a commentary on that. We are looking at the book of Luke with the mindset and an eye frame of relationships. And the relationships that we see in Luke and how those relationships relate to me and you. And so this morning, what we're going to be looking at is two things ultimately. One, we're going to be looking at the first couple of verses there that talks about the widow's offering. And then we're going to talk about the signs and the warnings that Jesus gives immediately for the destruction of Jerusalem, but also the signs and the times and for Jesus' second coming and how that relates to each and every one of us. And so that's our direction this morning. I don't know how far we will actually get in it, but we will do our best to get through all of that. And so as we understand that, the relationship of Jesus, the relationship that we have to Him, but also the relationship that we have with God and the warnings that they gave to us, let us begin by reading Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. And Josh, would you mind reading that for me? Okay, thank you, Josh. Very simple verses. Not a whole lot that goes on as far as, context and things of that nature. This is pretty easy for us to understand, right? Jesus is observing people putting money into, and He notices everyone that's putting it in there, but He notices one person, and who is it? It's a widow. And remember, when we are talking about the book of Luke, there is an emphasis that's upon the upside down kingdom, right? Which means that all the things that people tend to understand about a kingdom and who those individuals are that are running the kingdom and how that kingdom is put together, those things are turned upside down, and it's not the usual characters that we see that Luke picks up on here in Luke. It's these individuals that are not often looked at, right? It's the individuals like fishermen instead of the lawyers. It's the widow in this case as opposed to all of the rich people. And so when we look at this and we read it in chapter 21, it says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and He saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And His response to that was, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. Would this have been a shock to the apostles? Would this have been a shock to anyone as He makes this statement? Would it have been a shock to us if we're sitting there looking at that and people are putting in a lot of money, and then all of a sudden here comes this widow and she gives very little, but Jesus says she gave way more than all the others? Would that have been a shock to us? Yeah. For they all contributed out of their what? Out of their abundance. But she, out of her what? Out of her poverty, put in all that she had. Now that brings a good discussion point, and one that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this morning, and that is how Jesus' teaching on storing treasures in heaven aligns with what we're reading here. In a kingdom, you have to have what in order to be able to fund your soldiers, your government? What do you have to have? You have to have money, right? And you have to have lots of money in order to do that. And Jesus' teachings is not a teaching of, I want the rich, but I want the what? I want the poor. how's the poor going to help in these situations? What do they have that the rich don't have? A lot, right, Kenny? But what do we mean by a lot? What do they have? Huh? They have heart, right? What else do they have? Humility. Very important. And that is something I think we see constantly throughout this. And I think Jeremy taught about that on Wednesday night. And I think maybe even Micah as well. The relationship of Jesus and the reality of being humble. But what else are we missing here? What else do those that don't have a lot of money have that those who do have money don't have? What's that? The sacrificial heart is very important, I think, there. Yes, Kenny?
It's character. I mean, the thing about it is when you have a lot of money, you learn how to play political games because you recognize everybody's after your money.
Right.
And you have to be very, that puts you in a position of a lot of power. Here's somebody who has divested herself of power, not because she wanted to, because she never had access to it. And she's gotten very comfortable with that. She is in a place of poverty. She's in a place of powerlessness. She is not important. The money that she gets is not that much.
Right.
It will not do much. But I think what Jesus keeps on saying is, I don't care about this other stuff. It is the character that I'm going to focus on.
Yeah.
The character is the only thing that transcends everything else you got going on.
Yep. And I think the important thing of what Jesus is trying to teach them is the people that Jesus is around, the ones who he calls to be his apostles, are not rich, right? Not rich by any means. But there is the possibility that the things that go on behind the scenes, and I'll give you a good case in point of that. We have one character that Jesus does call, that is an apostle, that has that problem. Who is it? Judas, right? It says that Judas from the beginning, his mindset, he was focused on what? The money bag. And so do you think along the way that there is this teaching of Jesus that the importance of you following me has nothing to do with your desire for more money, but your desire for God? And I think that is important for us. Even more so today, it's important for us because how many of us, if I ask this question, how many of us are rich? Raise your hand. Kenny raised his hand. So if you need any money, Kenny's the one that's rich. None of us would consider ourselves rich, right? But every single one of us are rich. How do you define rich? Because I think that's at the heart of what we're talking about. How do we define if we are rich or not? And how do we define if I ask that question, if you're rich, you put your hand up. How do we define that?
Sort of like the verse defines it, if we have a surplus.
Okay.
We have more than what we need for our essential living.
Yeah. If we have an abundance, right, as the verse says. How many of you have an abundance? I think most of us would do that. You know, I have been guilty of doing this before. I have been guilty of getting to a point in a mindset where I would say, if I ever get X, then I'll help out more. If I ever make this amount of money, then I can donate more and I can help out people more or I can do more. Anybody ever been guilty of that? How many of you are guilty of saying, I've got it now and now I'm going to help? How many of us have gotten to the point where we feel like right now I'm comfortable and I can help and I can do all these things? And the reason I bring all that up is every single one of us are at that point right now. Whether we talk about abundance, whether we're talking about having very little, every single one of us, I can almost guarantee you, in the context of our lives here in America and the United States, and Kenny can tell you all about it, of others in other countries, we have what? We have an abundance. We have too much. Now, I'm going to tell myself here. Kenny, in those countries you went to, how many shoes did those people have, do you think? How many of you have more than 2 pair of shoes? I better see everybody's hand, because I can guarantee you not a single person in here only has 1 pair of shoes. And if you do have 1 pair of shoes, please let me know. How many of you have more than 5 pairs of shoes? How many of you have more than 5 pair of camo Crocs, Jeremy? There we go. That's what I thought. We have more than we think we do, don't we? And behind that is the humbleness of our heart and the sacrificial heart. And that is the lesson in which he is trying to teach us that there are dangers in wealth, but there's also dangers in thinking that we're not there. Because the danger of us thinking that we're not wealthy is just as dangerous as thinking that we are wealthy. And so when we think about that, I was thinking about the rich young ruler, which, has to do with when Jesus asked him, when the rich young ruler asked him, what do I need to do? What's the one thing that Jesus told him he needed to do to obtain eternal life? Catherine?
He told him to sell everything he had, give to the poor, and come follow him.
Okay. So I got to thinking this morning. He said, sell everything you have and do what with it? And give to the poor. What do you think would have happened, or do you think anything would have changed if Jesus would have said, sell half of what you have and give it to the poor? What if Jesus told him, sell 1/10 of what you have and give it to the poor? Do you think it would have changed? Okay. So that brings me back to what I was originally talking about is the mindset and that danger of wealth there is if we can't get to a point where we're willing to give it all, there's going to be a danger of us giving any. And that's the point, and that's what Jesus is trying to get at here is, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33 talks about seeking what? Seeking first the kingdom of God. If we can't get in our mindset to do that first, then all these other things are going to be very difficult for us to do. And when we talk about generosity and charity, I don't remember if it was Kenny or who it was when we got to the Good Samaritan and we talked about that. And the point of that was, these individuals that really had no social distinction other than we stay away from them. They were the ones that were willing to help. They were the ones that were willing to do what needed to be done. And yet these individuals who prided themselves on being the individuals that would help or should have been helping, they were not the ones. And so I think the idea there is that, the warning, I guess, if anything, and this is the relationship that we're talking about this morning, our relationship to the future, we can jeopardize our relationship to the future, meaning our future home in heaven, if we're not willing to do these things that he's talking about. Yeah, Kenny.
There's also something, when you talk about the Good Samaritan, you're talking about a priest and a Levite. They had the right doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
They knew the right thing.
Yep.
They had the right law. They had the right God. They didn't do the right thing. And I think there's a danger in thinking we got the doctrine down, therefore we're good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very dangerous place to be. And I think that's one of Jesus' point, which is notice these people who don't have the right doctrine, don't worship at the right mountain, and they're doing good things.
Yeah.
You think you have something to learn from them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's also the lesson here and the danger of, of us not having humility, which I think goes back to what we originally talked about with the heart. And also, I put this in here, detachment. I think I put the word detachment because we become so fixated and attached to the world that we have a very difficult time detaching ourselves from the world. And I can step on my toes and everybody's toes and say and give examples of how that's true. There are some things that we're willing to go all the way. When God says, give this up, we're willing to go completely all the way and give it up. But there are other things that are in our lives, and you can fill in the blank to what that is. There are other things that I guarantee you hold us back from giving it all. And that's where Jesus said, if you're willing to follow me, then you need to take up what? Your cross and follow me. That means everything that's going to hold you back needs to die. And that taking up that cross means that you're what? Where does that cross lead? It leads to death. And so these are warnings that I think, and again, I could spend all morning talking about this, the widow, and her gift and the dangers of being rich. Yeah, go ahead, Trace.
I think maybe one other aspect of this too is that this widow, being a widow, she was in need and understood need better than these rich men that were giving their gifts.
Yeah.
And she was constantly relying on others and on God to meet her daily needs as a widow.
Right.
And so her gift was a demonstration of how strong her faith was, that she could give away everything she had and still know she would be provided for.
Yeah.
And I think no matter what state of life you find yourself in, whether you're rich or poor, or however much money or assets you have, or anything like that, as long as you keep that perspective that it's from God and that you need God, despite whatever you have, because our danger, right, is we become self-reliant.
Yep.
We feel like I've got enough in the bank, I can solve all my problems, but we know that's not the case because
Right.
there's lots of things that money can't fix in life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being a good steward of that and doing good things with it is obviously what God calls us to do.
Yep.
But having that recognition of our need for God is what is at the foundation of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. How do we know that? I mean, you just think about, you go back to the Old Testament, right? We go back to the children of Israel when they leave Egypt. And God tells them that I will provide for you. And He does provide for them, right? He provides manna for them. And even He provides the manna and He tells them, you will have the provisions that you need for that day. But what happened when they decided they wanted to take more and store it up? It rotted. What was the lesson there? I'll provide for you, right? You don't need to do it on your own. You don't need to store it up because I will provide for you. And that's been a constant theme. And I appreciate Chase for making that comment that it doesn't matter how much money we have or we don't have. The reality is, and what the lesson there is that we need to rely upon God to provide those things, because once we get to a certain point and we think that I've got all the money, I've got all the things that I need, it's at that point where God says, this night your soul is going to be required of thee. Yes, Gary.
Jerry, some great points you're making here on these first 4 verses of chapter 21. I'm just curious if you think maybe Jesus was reflecting back to the last few verses of chapter 20, and maybe this wasn't the greatest chapter break in history.
Yep.
He's referring to the religious leaders, and there in verse 47, he says they devour the widows' houses, and maybe Jesus is still kind of reflecting on his displeasure with that as far as what they're doing here in the first 4 chapter 21.
I 100% agree with that. 100%. And again, that is exactly what you talk about. You know, when we read our Bibles today, there are these chapter divisions that are put in there. And I think sometimes there are these moments where when we end a chapter, we immediately think that's the end of that thought. And that's not the case. And I agree 100% that I think that is part of the reason why he makes this mention here, is he uses that example to go back to what was happening in those previous verses there. So, very good observation. Any other questions or comments about the widow's mite before we move on? Because I'm so excited to get into these end time discussions. All right, we'll move on. All right, chapter 21, let's read verses 5 through 11. And Gary, would you mind reading those for us? I noticed. Okay, well, I'll have Mike do it then. I was waiting for you because you started to drink water, so I thought I would pick on you then. Go ahead, Mike.
And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, as for these things that you see, the days will come where there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And they asked him, Teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, see that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, and do not be afraid, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilence, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven.
Okay, thank you. So here they are. They're having a discussion about the widow. Jesus is listening to everyone talk about the temple. And what is Jesus telling them? What does he tell them? Look at how beautiful this temple is. Look at these stones. Look at this. And Jesus is saying, get ready. There's going to come a moment when this is no longer going to exist. When he says that, what do you think their reaction was to that? It took how long to build this? And it's going to be destroyed? This is Jerusalem. This is where God's people are. And Jesus says what? It's going to be destroyed. Now, how long is it going to take for that to happen? If we think at this time period here is around 30, 31, 32 AD, how long is it going to take for this temple to be destroyed? 30 years. About 40 years, right? 40, 30, 40, somewhere in there, rounding. What happens to that temple? This is where I ask those questions so you can teach me. What happens to that temple? It's destroyed, right? Completely destroyed in AD 70. And who destroys it? Where's my Josephus people at? Huh? Okay. It's completely destroyed. And Jesus says that, when this happens, right, here's the signs of when this is going to happen. So let's just look at the signs. He says, what are the signs? One stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And they ask, Teacher, when will these things be? And what will the sign of these things about to take place? And he doesn't go immediately into it, but he tells them, see that you are not led what? Astray. They're immediately looking for signs, right? How are we going to know this? And he tells them, he gives them a warning. And the warning is, don't be led astray by these things. Don't be afraid about these things, but don't be led astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he. And the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. I've been on this earth for 43 years, and since I've been alive, there's been rumors of wars, there's been earthquakes, there's been all these things that he is talking about. There's individuals that have identified themselves as Christ's second coming, individuals that have said, I am he, and yet here we are. And Jesus says there's going to be individuals in the next 40 years that are going to be just like this. There's going to be these rumors. And He said, do not be led astray. But He goes on to say that, then He said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences. And there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. All these warnings that Jesus is giving here, are these things that we see today? We have it going on right now, right? Right now we have it going on. Is it a sign of the times? Is it time for the second coming of Christ? I don't know. But when Jesus was telling them this, He was specifically talking about an event that was about to happen in about 40 years. And His point to them was, I think what we need to focus more so on is not the warnings, but what He tells them in verse 12. But before all this, and remember, who's He talking to? Who's He talking to? I hear the whispers. Who's He talking to, Mike? His disciples. And He says, but before all this, they will do what? Lay their hands on you. What's He preparing them for? Persecution. Delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. Now, He is specifically talking to them and saying, you are going to be persecuted. You are going to be brought before kings and governors. And in all of that, I think verse 13 is a hidden gem. All of this is going to happen. He says in verse 13, this will be what?
You bear testimony to me.
This will be an opportunity, right? How many of us, in light of temptations and trials and things that we're going through, in sickness and things like that, how many of us look at that as an opportunity to bear testimony to who Jesus is? I can tell you right now, Matthew Basford did a fantastic job of that. I didn't know Matthew other than songs and following him on Facebook. But in light of everything that he was going through, he still bared testimony to his great God. Do you think it would have been difficult being persecuted during the first century? Knowing that Jesus is saying that we're about to be destroyed, this Jerusalem's about to be destroyed, you are going to be persecuted, they're going to lay hands on you, they're going to deliver you into prisons. And the purpose of that is for you to testimony, for your testimony. Settle it, verse 14, settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. What? If I'm going before governors and I'm having to make an argument for myself on why I should live or die, do you think I take moments to think about what I'm going to say? And he says, don't do it. Because why? Chase?
You're going to put the words of the wisdom in their mouth.
Chase has already talked about the fact that because I will take care of you. I will provide. I'm telling you right now, I would struggle with that. I would struggle being before these individuals, and I would struggle with keeping my mouth shut and not arguing for myself. How hard do you think it was for Jesus to do the same thing? How hard do you think it was? And I go back to Paul. And Paul and him going from one to the other to the other. And he had the opportunities to take up for himself, right? He had the opportunities to say, you have no authority nor right to hold me here. But Paul said, this is so that I can do what? Verse 13. So that I could bear testimony. And these are opportunities. And I think if you read the book of Philippians, Paul talks about that. He talks about the fact that these are opportunities for me being in these prisons to talk to individuals that I normally would have never had an opportunity to talk to. My mind's not there yet. My mind's not there. But that's the reliance that God wants. And that's the reliance in which He is talking about here. And, all these warnings that are given to prepare them for that. Prepare them that judgment is coming. Prepare them that there is going to be some bad things that are about to happen. And I want you to be prepared for it, but I want you to be prepared to talk about it. Kenny.
There was two types of persecution that were going to happen in the first century Christians.
Mm-hmm.
I think his disciples were most worried about Rome and Roman persecution. But when you get to Acts, the 6th and 7th chapter, Stephen's not persecuted by Romans, he's persecuted by Jews. And
Yeah.
people that will kill him will be Jews. And it's a beautiful illustration of exactly what you're talking about there. In Stephen's own defense, he doesn't even mention his own name. He basically talks about who the Israelites were and the failures of the Israelites. And then he said, you guys are the failures.
Yeah.
And that's the, again, it was an opportunity for him to defend the gospel.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty amazing thing.
It is. And again, I'm not there yet. That's difficult. It's extremely difficult to be in that spot, and my mindset flipped to think about that. Because I'm all about self-preservation. But the importance in what we've been discussing here in the relationship is exactly that. The relationship that we have with Jesus, once we become closer and closer to Him, the more we're willing to sacrifice ourselves for Him. It's the marriage relationship, right? Husbands that are willing to give their lives for their spouses. They wouldn't do that immediately. But the more they get to know them, the more of a relationship they have with them, the closer they become. That is where that idea of two becoming one. And that's the same analogy of what we need with Jesus. We need to become what? One with Him. And the point that we would give up our lives for Jesus. And again, that's a difficult concept, and it's one that, given the circumstances and being put in a position like that, I always ask myself, would I make the right decision? And I never want to answer it because my answer is always going to be, of course. But given the circumstances, I don't know if that would be the case or not. Continuing on through this, when we look here, because we've got about 5 minutes or so, what I want us to get out of this is, I'm not going to give a commentary on the end times and what that's going to look like and when that's coming, because the purpose of what we're talking about this morning is what our relationship looks like in light of these warnings and what our responsibility is with these warnings. And I'll go ahead and just put it all on the table and tell you what He's asking us to do is to be what? Prepared. If you leave those doors this morning and you're like, what was Jerry's lesson about? All you have to say is about being prepared. Y'all got that? That's it. That's all that I'm teaching this morning is our relationship to Jesus is about being prepared. Not being prepared just today, but being prepared every day because, again, 80, 70 happened, but Jesus is coming again. And when He comes again, will we be ready? And I don't know when that's going to be, and you don't know when that's going to be. And there's not a single thing in this context of what we're studying here that's telling us when that's going to be. Because not even Jesus knows when that's going to be. But the point is that we're prepared when it does happen. And the reality of that is, it may or may not happen in our lifetime, but there will be a trigger. And that trigger is either our deaths or the second coming. And we've got to be prepared for either one of those. And not get distracted by, the television evangelists, the people in the papers, all the individuals that say, let's decipher these signs and tell you when the second coming of Christ is going to be. Again, the purpose of it, the importance of it is just for us to be ready, and emphasizing that importance for us to be ready when Jesus comes. I asked the question when I was thinking about this, how would we react? How would we react if we were given an exact timeline that said, Tampa's a pretty place to live, but it's going to be destroyed? And here's the signs of what's going to happen when it's going to be destroyed. What would our reaction be to that? Right? I'm moving somewhere else, right? Texas, somewhere. That could happen. It could happen in our lifetime. It could happen any time. And if it did happen, it's not about us gathering all our stuff and moving away. It's about us being what? Being ready, being prepared. And no one's ever prepared for anything like that. No one is. But being ready. Anybody got any questions about this? I know there's a lot that we've left on the table here. There's a lot more that we could read about. The promise of Christ's return, the hope of His return, things of that nature. But what we want to focus in on is not the fact that all these things have already happened, not the fact that the persecution will come, but the fact that we need to be prepared for it when it does come. And the testimony of when it does happen, let us not put ourselves in a corner. Let's not put ourselves in a position where we are sad and we're lonely and we can do it ourselves, but to put our reliance upon God, to testify how great our God is, and that whether we survive this or not, there's something better coming. And I think maybe that may be our focus, and that may be what we need to think about is no matter what happens here on earth, no matter what wars we go through, no matter what happens with countries and things like that being destroyed, the most important thing that we need to keep focused on is Christ, His kingdom, and where do I fit into that? I think I got 1 minute or 2 minutes. Anybody have any questions about this? Yes, sir.
Going back to your self-reliance point, I think when we go to Matthew, when Jesus says, unless you become as little children, I think many times we think of that just as forgiveness.
Right.
But it's being fully dependent on Him.
Right. That's a good point. Yes, sir.
I really think that God wants us in Scripture, rather than just with problems and the world and other things, just have a suitcase of ready to run. He wants us to make a difference in the world and chapter and areas. He said over Matthew chapter 28, tell men, go into all the world and make disciples of all men, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Teach them to observe all things which are commanded.
Yeah. His comment was, about, he's not telling us to pack a suitcase and get ready. He's telling us to go into the world and preach the gospel. Jeremy?
You asked the question a few minutes ago. If we knew the exact timeline of when Tampa was going to be destroyed, I think we should spend time telling other people, hey, this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be prepared also.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Anything? Kenny, do you have something?
I think campus is short about 10 years ago.